What if I told you the story you know about Japan is wrong? We think of Japan as this ancient, unchanging culture, a people isolated on their islands for millennia. But is that the truth? Where did the Japanese really come from? For decades, we thought we had the answer, a simple story of replacement. But recent DNA evidence, just a few years old, has completely shattered that theory. The real story is a 30,000-year-old epic involving ghost-like hunters, revolutionary farmers, and mysterious tomb builders from across the sea. The origins of the Japanese people are not a straight line, but a tangled, astonishing triple helix of ancestry. Stick around because the truth is way more complex and way more interesting than you can imagine.
All right, let's rewind the clock. Way back. Not 100 years, not 1,000, but 30,000 years. Forget the Japan you know with its neon cities and tranquil temples. Picture a totally different world. This is the Pleistocene, the peak of the last ice age. Sea levels are so low that Japan isn't even an island. It's a peninsula, tethered to the vast continent of Asia by frozen land bridges. And walking across this frigid, dangerous land were the first ever humans to set foot here. So who were these people? For the longest time, they were like ghosts in the historical record. We knew someone was here, thanks to a few scattered stone tools. They were big game hunters, tracking Naumans, elephants, and giant deer across the plains. A tough, brutal existence. You'd think that's all there is to the story, right? A primitive people living a primitive life. But that's where you'd be wrong. Because around 16,000 years ago, these ghost people did something that absolutely baffles archaeologists to this day. They started making pottery. Now, I know what you're thinking. Pottery? So what? Oh no, this is a huge deal. See, the old rule book of anthropology says that people only invent pottery after they invent farming. You settle down, you grow crops, and then you need pots to store your surplus food. It makes perfect sense. But these people in ancient Japan, they were still hunter-gatherers. They hadn't invented agriculture. They just decided to invent the world's first pottery thousands of years before anyone else on the planet. This is the culture we now call the Jomon, which means cord-marked, named for the beautiful rope patterns they pressed into the wet clay. And this one invention tells us they weren't just surviving, they were thriving. How do you invent pottery without farms? What were they even putting in these pots? The answer is that as the Ice Age ended and the world warmed up, Japan became a paradise, a lush forest teeming with nuts, plants, and animals. The sea, rich with fish and shellfish. The Jomon figured out how to master this environment so well they didn't need farming. They created a new way of life, the complex hunter-gatherer. They built settled villages with pit houses, created stunning lacquerware, and carved mysterious clay figurines called dogu with huge goggle-like eyes. And they lasted for over 10,000 years. Let that sink in. The entire history of ancient Egypt, Greece, and Rome combined is just a blip compared to the Jomon period. They were arguably one of the most successful and long-lasting cultures in human history. So the big question is, if they were so successful, where did they go? After 10 millennia of dominating the Japanese archipelago, they seemed to just fade away from the archaeological record. What could possibly bring down a culture that had survived for so long? Hey, before we solve that mystery, I just want to say thanks for joining me on this deep dive. Our channel, The Unifying Lens, is all about uncovering these hidden histories to understand how our modern world came to be. We're a small team, and every single subscription helps us piece together these incredible stories. So if you enjoy unraveling the past, please consider hitting that subscribe button. It truly means the world to us. Okay, so the Jomon, this incredibly resilient 10,000-year-old culture, seemingly vanishes. What happened? Well, they didn't vanish, they were engulfed. Around 900 BCE, a new group of people started arriving from the Asian mainland, likely from the Korean peninsula, and they brought a revolution with them. We call them the Yayoi. The Yayoi were totally different. They brought three things that would forever change Japan: bronze, iron, and the most important technology of all, wet rice farming. This was a game changer. Suddenly, you could produce a massive surplus of food. This surplus led to a population explosion. Villages grew into larger settlements, which grew into proto-kingdoms. Social classes appeared: farmers, artisans, warriors, and rulers. In just a few hundred years, Japan went from a land of egalitarian hunter-gatherers to a stratified agricultural society on the brink of forming a state. But was this a peaceful transition? Did the Jomon see these new rice paddies and think, hey, that looks like a good idea, and just adopt the new lifestyle? For a long time, this was a huge debate. But now, genetics gives us a much clearer and, frankly, more brutal picture. This was not a gentle blending, it was a replacement. DNA from ancient Jomon and Yayoi skeletons shows a massive genetic shift. The Yayoi people didn't just share their technology, they brought their DNA and it spread like wildfire. In most of Japan, the Jomon genetic signature was almost completely wiped out, replaced by this new wave of ancient ancestry. This became known as the dual structure model. Ancient Jomon hunter-gatherers were replaced by immigrant Yayoi farmers. The end. But is the story ever that simple? Of course not. What if I told you there's a living clue to this ancient puzzle? On the northernmost island of Japan, Hokkaido, lived the indigenous Ainu people. For centuries, their origins were a mystery. They looked physically different from mainland Japanese people and had a unique language and culture. Genetic testing gave us the shocking answer. The Ainu have the highest percentage of Jomon DNA of any population on Earth. They are the closest living link we have to Japan's first people. This suggests that in the far north, the Yayoi wave had less impact and the Jomon bloodline survived. So, for decades, that was the story. The Jomon were overwhelmed by the Yayoi, with the Ainu as a rare remnant. It all made sense. And then, in 2021, a new study came out that threw a grenade into the whole thing. Scientists analyzed DNA from skeletons found in the Kofun period. That's the era right after the Yayoi, from around 300 to 700 AD. This was the time of the great tomb builders, the ones who created those massive keyhole-shaped burial mounds for their emperors and chieftains. Everyone assumed these Kofun people were just the descendants of the Yayoi. They were wrong. The DNA showed a third major ancestral group, a group we never knew was there. These Kofun Arab people had a significant amount of ancestry tracing back to the Han Chinese of ancient China. This wasn't a small group of travelers, it was another massive wave of migration. So the story wasn't a simple replacement. It wasn't Jomon plus Yayoi, it was Jomon plus Yayoi plus this new Kofun group. It's a triple layer cake of ancestry. These Kofun Arab migrants brought with them the technology of empire, centralized government, advanced metalworking, and, crucially, a writing system adapted from Chinese. They were the ones who forged the first unified Japanese state, the Yamato Kingdom, which would eventually give rise to the imperial line. This changes everything. It means the Japanese people weren't formed by one or two waves of people, but by a complex three-part fusion: a prehistoric hunter-gatherer, a Bronze Age farmer, and an Iron Age state builder. So how on earth did these three completely different groups become one people? So here we are. This new research, what they call the tripartite or triple structure model, is now the leading theory for Japanese origins. And it paints a picture that is so much richer and more fascinating than the simple replacement story. It's not a story of conquest, but of layering, assimilation, fusion. Think of it like this. The original Jomon people are the foundation. They provided the deep, resilient, ancestral bedrock, a population perfectly adapted to the Japanese archipelago for over 10,000 years. Their DNA wasn't erased, it was absorbed, and it still makes up a meaningful percentage, around 10 to 15%, of the modern Japanese genome. They are the deep current of the river. Then came the Yayoi. They were a massive tributary that crashed into the river, bringing the agricultural revolution. They changed the river's course, its speed, and its fundamental chemistry. They provided the population boom and the agricultural base that made everything else possible. Their DNA forms the largest single component of the modern Japanese gene pool. Finally, the Kofun peoples arrived. This was a third, powerful stream carrying the tools of political centralization and high culture from the continent. They didn't replace the Yayoi Jomon mix, they organized it. They built upon the foundation that was already there, channeling the river's energy, building dams and canals, and transforming it into the basis for an empire. Their ancestry is the final crucial ingredient that forged the classical Japanese civilization. So, who are the Japanese people? They are the product of this 30,000-year-old process. They are the descendants of Ice Age Jomon hunters who invented pottery, of continental farmers who introduced rice, and of equestrian warriors who built an empire. This story completely demolishes the myth of a single, pure, isolated Japanese people. Like almost every other population on Earth, their origins are a story of migration, mixing, and reinvention. The serene, timeless image of Japan is just that, an image. The reality is a dynamic, multi-layered history that begins tens of thousands of years ago. The answer to where did the Japanese come from isn't a single place on a map. It's a long and epic journey through time. So, from Ice Age Jomon hunters to Yayoi rice farmers and finally to the Kofun state builders, the story of Japan is a triple helix of DNA. What part of this 30,000-year epic surprised you the most? Did you know about the brand new three-part ancestry theory? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And as always, if you enjoyed this journey into the past, please hit that like button, subscribe to the Unifying Lens, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next historical deep dive.